Good morning and welcome. Delighted to have all of you here this morning, and especially those who are recovering from yesterday's first playoff game. We were going to decorate this in black crepe, but didn't have enough time to do that. I think Jim Brett may give us a rundown of exactly where the mistakes were made in the second half, so while we're waiting for Senator Murphy, we might get to that. Delighted that Senator Blumenthal is with us, and Senator Murphy will be joining us shortly. Let me just first thank our sponsors, Mass Mutual, Stanley Black & Decker, and United Technologies for sponsoring this breakfast, and certainly acknowledge our partnership with Jim Brett and Larry Zabar and the rest of the New England Council team, and thank Patrick McGloin on our staff for having pulled this together. Also want to acknowledge that you'll see in the inside part of your program our partnership with the other Metro chambers here in the state. I know several of them are represented here this morning. I saw Paul Timpanelli from Bridgeport here, and there may be one or two others representing those organizations. We are, just as a heads up, we're working together as we go into this session to see where we can make a difference collectively along with CBIA on a couple of key matters, particularly on budget efforts, offering our services to the governor to try to see where we can establish more vibrant and sustained public-private partnerships where the expertise in this room and elsewhere can be leveraged more effectively. So more to come on that. I know Bonnie Malley is here this morning, and I'm sure all of you saw the announcement that she will be joining Mayor Bronin's administration later in February, and as I said in the announcement that we sent out, saying how much we will miss her, but how much we look forward to working with her in the Bronin administration. So Bonnie, congratulations on that. It's great news for everybody. And just as a transition over to Jim, obviously a lot has been written and said about the decision by General Electric to move their headquarters from Connecticut to Boston. And we've sort of stayed on the sidelines a little bit with a more formal statement. But let me assure you that the reasons that were stated by GE, many reasons were stated, to a large degree reinforce what you all pay us to do. And that is focusing on the city to make sure it's the vibrant urban core of the region, to focus on the workforce issues, to work more closely with higher education so that the talent that we all want and need, that you all want and need for the future is focused on. So we'll speak out a little bit briefly more to you as our investors about what we're doing, but take it as a source of, is trying to find the glass is always half full, recognizing the very serious issues that we continue to have to deal with at the Capitol. We'll take it as a step forward and reinforce our commitment to making sure that this region and the state as a whole really does, in a competitive place, is in the best place possible to compete for jobs, for capital, and for talent. So with that, I'm going to I'll introduce Jim here in a second. He'll make a couple of comments, introduce Senator Blumenthal, and then we'll have Senator Murphy with us when he gets here. Jim did call me last week to find out whether it would be safe for him to enter the state of Connecticut after the GE decision. I talked with him at great length, and he assured me that during all the conversations he had with Jeff Immelt, he encouraged GE to stay in Connecticut. In fact, he encouraged them to move to Hartford. So please welcome our great friend from the New England Council, Jim Brett.
Thank you very much, Oz, for that softball introduction. Let me just say, on the New England Council's role in the GE decision, I think our role was to make sure that GE stays in New England, because we are a New England organization. We're not a Boston, we're not a state organization, we're New England. And we're just grateful that we have a prominent company remain in New England. Having said that, New England Council is honored once again to partner with our friends here at the MetroHartford Alliance for once again a very informative and engaging discussion this morning. The Council, New England Council, is fortunate to have a fantastic working relationship with Oz and the entire team here at the Alliance. And we're very grateful for their work, not only putting on today's event, but also what they do for the business community here in the Hartford area. I see a number of familiar faces from the New England Council here today, in particular two of our board members, Beth Barton and Kevin Hennessy, are here, but I know that some of you may not be familiar with the council. If I could just take one quick minute to give you a little update of who we are and what we do. The New England Council is the oldest regional business organization in our great country. In fact, we celebrated our 90th anniversary last year. We have over 550 members in all 6 New England states, and we represent all sectors of our economy and healthcare and technology and higher ed, financial service and energy, just to name a few. And the mission statement of the New England Council is to bring the region's business community together to advocate for federal policy that will promote economic growth and a quality of life in our region. In recent months, we've worked on a variety of issues that we believe are critically important to our region, including urging Congress to pass a long-term reauthorization of the federal surface transportation funding. In fact, they did that recently, 5 years, which is something they have not done in years, a 5-year funding that will allow certainty and allow for much-needed infrastructure improvement in our region. We all know about the bridges and the highways and the dredging, and this is very, very good news, and the 2 senators played a major role on the reauthorization. We also advocated for the renewal of the Ex-Im Bank to support exporters large and small here in this great state and in New England so that we can compete in the 21st century global economy. And finally, we called on the leaders in Washington to pass legislation to protect trade secrets that are very valuable assets to our region's many innovative businesses. We also spent a great deal of time here in Connecticut and other New England states in recent months sharing a very new report that was prepared with the support of Deloitte Consulting, a member of the New England Council, on the state of the advanced manufacturing sector here in New England. Well, today we're delighted to be here again in Connecticut, once again to hear from the 2 esteemed United States senators about their work in Congress on some of the critical issues facing Connecticut, but the entire New England region. As Oz mentioned, Senator Murphy is en route, and he'll be here very shortly. But I've had the opportunity to get to know and work with Senator Blumenthal on a variety of issues. And let me tell you, Connecticut is very lucky to have this remarkable man representing you in Washington. I know that both of them need very little introduction in this room, but if you allow me just to give you a little more information about Senator Blumenthal and some of his recent work. Senator Blumenthal, as all of us know, has served in the United States Senate since 2011. He previously served as Connecticut's Attorney General for some 20 years, during which time he was a national leader on issues like consumer protection, online safety, and environmental protection. In the United States Senate, he is currently the ranking member on the Veterans Affairs Committee, where he's been a tireless advocate for those who have served our nation. In November, he introduced bipartisan legislation to address reports of abuse in the VA healthcare system and to protect whistleblowers who report such abuse to protect their patients. He also advocated for tax credits to encourage employers to hire veterans and for expanding programs aimed at preventing homelessness among our veterans. Senator Blumenthal also sits on the Senate's Commerce, Science, and Transportation Committee, where he has worked closely with another fellow New Englander, the junior senator from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, Ed Markey, to improve automobile safety for consumers. Ladies and gentlemen, a warm welcome, United States Senator Blumenthal.
Richard, how are you? Why don't we sit down and make your comments sitting, and then we can do it that way, and then when Senator Murphy comes, we'll do that. Senator, thank you very much. Jim, thanks for your comments and your support on a number of things. Ideally, Senator Murphy will join us shortly. The way we set up the agenda is we wanted Senator Blumenthal, give him a few minutes to make some introductory remarks, and when Senator Murphy gets here, we'll give him the same opportunity. There are cards on your table. If there are questions you would like us to pose beyond the 400 I already have, feel free to write them, and we'll get them up here. Senator, welcome. Delighted you're here.
Thank you.
Why don't you share? Thank you very much for being on the radio interview over the weekend, and talked about a number of things there, transportation among them, but take a few minutes and
Sure.
some of the highlights for the audience.
Delighted to do that, and first of all, let me thank you, Oz, and Jim, and all of you for having me again. I see a lot of very familiar and friendly faces in this room. I've visited with you at your plants and your manufacturing floors and your places of business, and I've learned by listening. So my first thanks is to this organization and many of you for really educating me about what we need to do to drive economic growth and job creation here in the state of Connecticut. That's been one of my priorities from day one as a United States Senator, and there are some glimmers of hope. Jim discussed one of them, the massive transportation bill, the first in more than a decade that is 5 years in duration, $305 billion for the nation as a whole, $3.5 billion for Connecticut, a 10% increase. Is it enough? Nowhere near enough. The $19 million for Amtrak is a pittance compared to what we need, but it's a step in the right direction. It provides some certainty and stability in this funding that is so important. You may remember we were living from literally continuing resolution to continuing resolution. One of the lessons I've learned from you is that certainty and stability in government policy is absolutely vital, whether it is transportation or tax policy or any of the areas where government functions. The kind of predictability and certainty that you need to plan your businesses is absolutely vital. And in that connection, the omnibus bill, which provides for an extension of the R&D tax credit, so important to many of our defense and research and development companies. The R&D tax credit is extended for a period that businesses can plan on now. The deductibility of expenses, investments by small business in plant and equipment, again extended with predictability and reliability. The elimination of the medical device tax, very, very important to a number of our companies here. These are measures that I champion. We really work together as a team because we know how important they are to Connecticut businesses, and solar and wind tax credit. I went to visit just the other day Allied Printing here in Manchester, which has a roof full of solar. An area where we need to go forward and move forward again, where work is still vitally important, is in fuel cells. The tax credit was not extended for fuel cells. We got a commitment, I did, that we would have that tax credit extended. So a longer-term outlook from Washington, D.C., I think is very, very important. In terms of investment, it's not only investment in the physical plant, in roads, bridges, rail, that are so vital to our region. You know, Amtrak in this region is the only profitable route in the country. And we ought to be expanding Amtrak even further, but it's more than just investment in physical plant. There also has to be investment in our people, skill training. I go to businesses around the state of Connecticut. They have openings for people. They can't fill them. They don't have people with the training and experience that are needed to fill these positions. And so our vocational and technical schools, our community colleges, our higher education institutions, we rolled out just on Thursday, and I have helped to lead it, a college affordability program that will bring down debt resulting from higher education. As you know, right now, it's the highest debt other than mortgages in this country, $1.2 trillion. It's a drag on our students. It means they can't buy new homes, start businesses, build families. It's a drag on the entire economy. And so reducing the interest rates on college debt, both debt that is borrowed now, but also debt that's been incurred, and enabling people to go to community college tuition free, making available more Pell Grants, scholarships, financial aid. As I go to these colleges, and high schools, students will say to me, you know, I can't go to my dream school. I can't go to my first choice. I can't afford it. I can't ask my parents to subsidize it. I can't get the financial aid, and borrowing $100 or $150 or $200,000 simply makes it unaffordable for me. So this is an area where Connecticut and our nation needs to invest more. Let me just finish on this note, and then I know we're going to have a lot of other questions, and I'm happy that my colleague Chris Murphy has joined me so I don't have to use the age-old filibuster technique. Veterans. National security is a big issue, and we're probably going to talk about it here. We're at war with ISIS. We should have an authorization for the use of military force in that war against ISIS. We need to be smart and effective in the way we conduct that war, but we also need to be mindful of the people who have fought the 14 years of war up to now, and who have fought in previous wars. This nation, all too often, has failed to keep faith with our veterans. This mission has become one of my passions in the United States Congress, and it's not only the visible wounds of war, but the invisible wounds of war, post-traumatic stress and traumatic brain injury. One of the most powerful and moving of my days in the United States Senate was the passage of the Clay Hunt Veterans Suicide Prevention Act. I think when I was last here, I talked about this issue. This bipartisan measure, my co-sponsor was John McCain of Arizona, was passed by the Congress to provide more mental health care, more support, community outreach, and research into post-traumatic stress, which affects not only our post-9/11 veterans, but veterans of every war. Korea, Vietnam, undiagnosed then, but still affecting them. And this measure was passed. We went to the White House, and I stood next to the president as he signed this bill, John McCain next to me, and Clay Hunt's mom next to us. Clay Hunt was a Marine who came back from Afghanistan, suffering from post-traumatic stress. The VA failed him. And now we've made a down payment, just to start, not a finish, just to start toward dealing with these invisible wounds of war. Disability claims backlog, housing for our veterans, skills, job training, jobs, opportunities. This is what we owe our veterans. And this country ought to be investing in our veterans, just as we do in spending on the wars that involve them. So I'd be happy to answer questions. Thanks again for this opportunity.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Murphy, welcome. Delighted you're here. I understand you came up by dog sled from Washington, so thank you for making the effort to be here. And again, the same thing we did with Senator Blumenthal, a couple of minutes on some comments you want to make sure that the audience is aware of. And again, thank you for participating in the radio interview last week. Appreciate it.
Sure. Thank you very much, Oz. Thank you to Jim Brett and the New England Council, to many friends in the audience here today. I'll be very brief because I do want to get to questions, and I frankly think that Dick covered the landscape, it sounds like, of what happened at the end of last year fairly well. It bears repeating. Connecticut has a small delegation, right? We have 5 members in the House. We have 2 members in the Senate. And we think that we punch well above our weight class in terms of the dollars that come back to Connecticut. Maybe we'll get a little bit of time to talk about some of the major grant awards that Connecticut has received. We just received a major allocation of money for coastal resiliency from the Sandy Relief Fund. We actually got a bigger award out of this new section of money than New York and New Jersey did unexpectedly. We finished first in the rankings all across the country. And I think that that's largely because Connecticut makes a really strong case, and we have great folks who are writing grants at the state and local level. But I think that's also because we are very close as a delegation, all 7 of us. We are talking constantly about how to best leverage our small numbers for the state. Dick and I made the decision to not necessarily divvy up responsibilities, but make sure that we have the broad gamut of issues covered. Dick sitting on the Commerce Committee and Judiciary Committee, Veterans, Intelligence. I sit on the Appropriations Committee that writes all the checks, the Health and Education Committee, and then the Foreign Relations Committee. And I hope that I hope that we're leveraging our numbers for the maximum possible benefit for Connecticut. So listen, when I look at Connecticut and I think about federal impacts, I generally think about four areas. I think about the importance of federal education policy because we are a state that is going to grow jobs not based on the cost of our workforce, but on the quality of our workforce. I think about transportation. Obviously, we live and die based on our ability to move people and goods to New York and to Boston. I think about science because of this major new play we've made in bioscience that is already resulting in thousands of new jobs and thousands more to come. And then, of course, you think about defense because we've got a major defense footprint in this state. We have a greater share of our economy dedicated to manufacturing than the national average, substantially so, despite what people think of Connecticut as sort of a financial services-oriented state. So I think Dick's covered a lot of this, but let me just hit the highlights. First, with very little fanfare, the Education Committee that I sit on repealed No Child Left Behind at the end of last year and wrote a brand new education law that learns from our mistakes over the last 10 years, that gets the federal government out of the business of dictating what makes a good school, what interventions would turn around a good school, gets the federal government out of the practice of shaming schools that haven't lived up to expectations, and really hands control once again for educational policy back to the states. Now, it doesn't remove the expectation that states will hold schools accountable, but it doesn't tell states how to do that. That's going to be critical for Connecticut because No Child Left Behind wasn't designed for our state. No Child Left Behind was really designed for Mississippi and Alabama and states that had, taken their special education population and made them spend 75% of their day with the janitor instead of actually getting an education in mainstream classrooms. This is really good news for Connecticut because now we get to do what we've always done best, which is provide a fantastic education while being mindful of the things we need to do for vulnerable populations. I think Dick talked about what's in this bill for transportation. I sit on the Transportation Subcommittee and the Appropriations Committee. I went on that committee in order to grow funding for Connecticut. Maybe the most important thing in that bill is a small, tiny provision. For the first time ever, there is an account in the Appropriations Committee, and this was my number one priority in the appropriations process, that is dedicated for the Northeast Rail Corridor. As Dick mentioned, we're the only profitable piece of the Amtrak line. We make $300 million from Boston to Washington, D.C. every year, and all $300 million of that profit goes to subsidize money-losing operations in other parts of the country. For the first time ever, this bill keeps that $300 million here, and then on top of it, sets up a new fund dedicated only for maintenance on the Northeast Corridor. Now, it's not a lot of money, that separate account to begin with, but it's precedent setting, and it's going to allow us to start building that account to take care of the backlog. On research funding, fantastic news in this budget. Again, a major priority for me as a member of the Appropriations Committee, a $2 billion increase for NIH funding. Again, Connecticut is playing well above its weight class when it comes to getting research dollars. We now are better poised than ever with what's going on both in New Haven and in Farmington stores as well to capture those dollars. Doubled what the president asked for in the appropriations process. Great news for Connecticut. And then lastly on defense, Dick might have covered some of this, but again, as a member of the Appropriations Committee, member of the Armed Services Committee, we're really proud of the fact that not only were we able to win additional F-35 in this budget above what the president requested, that means more engines being produced by Pratt & Whitney, but we've stayed on track for 2 submarines a year at Electric Boat, the Virginia-class submarines, and we've stayed on track to make these enormous Ohio replacement-class submarines at the beginning of the next decade. That allows for EB and its suppliers to continue a dramatic ramp-up of workforce over the course of the next 5 to 10 years. That's great news, not just for southeastern Connecticut, but you've got literally hundreds of suppliers all across the state that are getting ready for that sub-ramp-up, which comes on the heels of the engine ramp-up. Huge challenges remain. I think we've gotten kind of used to declining deficits and a growing economy. You're going to see that change over the course of the next 5 to 10 year window. We're going to have a bubble in retirement costs in Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. So these declining deficits, where we've gotten them now down to under 3% of GDP, which is what most economists will recommend, aren't going to be the reality anymore. So fiscal discipline is going to be more important than ever as we sort of look at this bulge of retirement costs coming into the federal government. I know we'll get the chance to talk about foreign relations, so I won't cover that for now, but we've got some major challenges ahead of us, despite the good news coming out of the fight against ISIS in the region. We've got to remain vigilant, and we may be having that debate on authorization of military force that Senator Blumenthal referenced. So with that, Oz, again, thanks for having me here. Look forward to the discussion.
Pleasure, Senator. Thank you very much. Thank you. Just because I do want to make sure we talk about foreign affairs, military action, the issues in EU in terms of the impact of the Syrian refugees, all critical issues to Connecticut. But let's talk a little bit longer about economic growth in the state, and both talked about transportation. A couple of questions we've had coming in and then reinforced with a couple of cards I have here. One, just the importance of the financial services industry to this state, the impact that Dodd-Frank has had on certain aspects of it. We have a number of community banks, or smaller banks, not necessarily fighting the old traditional definition of community, but the implication of Dodd-Frank. Talk for a few minutes, just each of you briefly, on the importance of this sector to the retention of jobs in this state, and also the opportunities to grow them. Your perspectives on what, if any, impact you in your respective seats, recognizing you're not sitting necessarily on committees of cognizance, but like a Jim Hines is down in that district. But talk a little bit, if you would. I'll start with you, Senator Blumenthal, about the sector and things like Dodd-Frank and where you see things going for the state in that area.
I come from a part of the state that has a lot of financial services industry, and I have worked with them closely in trying to listen and heed some of the messages that I've heard about the need for additional changes in this law. One of the problems with Washington, let's be very blunt here, is the difficulty of accomplishing incremental change. Once the healthcare law or Dodd-Frank is set in stone, changing it incrementally has been very, very difficult. So I recognize the need for improvements in that law, as I do in the Affordable Care Act.
Right.
But so long as the debate is, do we repeal it, or do we have some measure of oversight and scrutiny greater than what we had before, we're not going to make progress. I do think there is the need to have some consensus, and I think there is, on points where additional reforms may be necessary, but we have to recognize here in Connecticut that this sector is very, very important to Fairfield County, and that we have the opportunity to compete very successfully with New York.
We do. Senator, comments you have on that?
Yeah, let me talk about...
We alive back? We all right back there? All right.
Let me talk about two specific issues that I hope we can find some consensus on moving forward. The number one priority for the Financial Services Committee in the last several months of the year was the desire, and this is still the number one priority, to get a rule right that is coming out of the Department of Labor any day now. And this is a rule that is going to set a new standard for financial advisors that are advising individuals on how they put money away for retirement. I think broadly everyone agrees that there should be a clear, easily understandable relationship between a financial advisor and someone they're advising, that you should be looking out for their best interests first, not your best interests first as the advisor. The worry is that this rule is going to come out in a way that would put a lot of business models out of business. Right. That matters greatly to a lot of companies that are headquartered in Connecticut that provide these services. So I've been a leader as a member of the Appropriations Committee, which strangely found itself at the epicenter of this conversation because of some riders that were requested onto the bill to try to find that sweet spot. I continue to believe that we can get a rule that makes the lines of responsibility clearer for consumers, but also doesn't put many of our most important companies here in Connecticut out of the business of giving advice to their consumers. Second, on the issue of how we implement Dodd-Frank. Listen, I think we should be putting the press on to continue to relieve small community banks of some of these burdensome financial regulations. You know, small banks tell me every day that the only people they're hiring these days are compliance individuals. Right. But we also have two really important, what we call mid-cap banks in Connecticut, right? We've got Peoples and Webster that, although are treated for the purposes of Dodd-Frank like a big bank, like a bank that holds systemic risk, actually operate much more like a community bank and have economic risk that look much more like a small bank. And so I hope one of the conversations we're going to be able to have this year as the dust kind of settles on Dodd-Frank is not just how we relieve the regulatory burden for community banks, but also maybe how we take a look at these mid-cap banks that are really important to Connecticut that in a lot of ways should be treated more like the smaller banks than like the bigger banks. So I just sort of point those two very specific issues out as opportunities where I think we can lead as the Connecticut delegation to make a difference for the industry here in Connecticut.
Well, go ahead. Good.
Just to add, on the first financial advisor rule issue, this is kind of a classic. Washington case study in how not to make a rule. This rule was originally proposed by the Department of Labor. I opposed it literally in the first year or so of serving as a United States Senator, along with a number of my colleagues. It was sent back to the Department of Labor. It was then sent to redrafted to, we believe, the Office of Policy and Management for its review under the regulations review process. We're now going on 5 years, and no one knows what the draft is. That seems incredible. We met with a number of officials recently to, in a sense, urge them, demand that something be made public so that we can see what the latest draft is. And I think that there is a consumer interest here. There's also an interest in the industry and having a fair and transparent process. And the present rulemaking procedure really is broken, and this is the best illustration of it, and it affects a variety of other areas. The tobacco regulations implementing Dodd-Frank, the failure to provide this certainty and reliability. I think all of it's very important. And even in the area of transportation, I'm on the Surface Transportation Committee of the Commerce Committee, so all of this transportation legislation goes through our committee. But a lot of the rulemaking then implements the legislation, and the rules are often as important, for example, dealing with rail safety, as the legislation. There are now more than 50 recommendations of the safety board that deals with rail that have not been implemented by the FHA, by the FRA, the Federal Rail Administration. And that kind of lag in rulemaking is very important. So we tend to focus on the most visible part of this process, and the rulemaking is equally important.
Thank you, Senator. It's just from our standpoint, as you both know, we have a Connecticut insurance and financial services cluster. We focused on this sector for the last decade or more, right now under Susan Winkler's leadership. So the more we can stay in that gauge, it's such a critical component of our current employment base as well as the future. Shift gears, I'll start with you, Senator Murphy, on this one. You mentioned the NIH grants. Senator Blumenthal mentioned the reform to ACA. Talk a little bit about the health sector, because when you look at economic and employment retention in this state and opportunities for growth, it is in that broad area of health care, whether it's our hospitals, our medical schools, the health insurers that have major presences here. How do we, as you look at this as an opportunity to grow jobs in that sector, attract additional capital investment? Talk about that first, if you would, Senator, and I'll go to Senator Blumenthal.
Sure. Well, I mentioned the best news, which is this massive new infusion of funding into NIH, and that's not likely a one-time infusion. That sets a new baseline for NIH funding. So you're talking about $2 billion in this budget, likely carried over into the next budget. That money is going to find its way largely into public institutions here in Connecticut. But there's good news on the private sector investment side as well, which was in the tax package. We have this, yearly crisis in which the research and development tax credit is in threat of becoming extinct. We now have permanently authorized the R&D tax credit, which, is transformational for a lot of companies, because in the R&D space, it allows you to sort of make investments in the long term, knowing that you're going to be able to take that benefit at year end on your taxes. So those are two really important planning tools for research here in Connecticut. In the healthcare sector writ large, we're at a moment of consolidation, right? And it's happening both on the provider level and it's happening on the insurer level. And of course, one begets the other. As providers get bigger, then insurers have to get bigger in kind. There certainly is a moment at which you get too big and there starts to be a harm to the consumer. But I think especially on the provider side, I think there are real benefits that come to consolidation done the right way. And I am slightly contrarian on this notion. I know there's a movement here in Connecticut in the legislature to try to put blockades in the way of not-for-profit consolidation. I think if you do it the right way, you get economies of scale and efficiencies related to quality that can benefit both cost and benefit quality in the end. And so I think if you do it the right way, it's really important. As many of you know, I think major institutional for-profit conversions is not the right way to go. I think there's a lot of room for for-profit medicine. I don't think it belongs in the inpatient acute care setting. But we've seen some, I think, important consolidations in the nonprofit world happen that are beneficial to the state, and some pending consolidations that both Senator Blumenthal and I have some questions about on the payer side as well. So the federal government's got to sort of be awake to that reality and be flexible to understand how these new consolidations will affect states like Connecticut. But that's the world we're living in. If we do it right, I think it can be good for both investors, patients, and practitioners.
You may want to need that one. You and I will go back and forth with that. We can both sing a tune later on.
Okay. Well, let me begin just as a kind of human reflection on this NIH budget. One of the most powerful revelations to me was a lunch where I listened to Dr. Collins, who's the head of NIH, talk about what we were sacrificing in the way of research as a result of the arbitrary slashing cuts in his budget at NIH. The term sequester is not exactly a household word in Connecticut or around the country, but sequester, you'll recall, was the policy of making cuts across the board in both defense and non-defense programs, a policy that was so abhorrent that it was actually supposed to incentivize a budget agreement. When the budget agreement wasn't reached,
sequester went into effect, which resulted in very severe cuts across the board to NIH and, by the way, to our defense budget. And one of the accomplishments that we did in the Armed Services Committee was to segregate out the submarine program and to continue this building of 2 subs a year to make sure that we continue to build the F-35 despite doubts about it, and the helicopter programs, all of them very, very important to Connecticut. And I was very proud to fight for them, not just because they benefit Connecticut, but they're vital to our national security. And that program was in peril because of sequester. So was the NIH budget. And what I heard from the NIH director was cancer research, other kinds of vital life-saving research that was being delayed or defunded or applications denied because of sequester. So this is a really important step for healthcare in America, but also for job creation and for economic growth, because we know in Connecticut, because of the biotech revolution or evolution progress here, that we can be a center of this kind of research and development. I think, I'll just be very blunt, the mergers that have been proposed among insurers raise very, very serious questions. They raise serious antitrust questions. I've said publicly that I just don't think they'll pass muster. I've called for an investigation by the Department of Justice. The Department of Justice has agreed to do it, and it has agreed, equally important, to do it in the way that I suggested and urged, that it look at the whole industry, not merger by merger, but the entire industry, because I think that there are impacts on the fairness and competitiveness that can ripple down through the process for reasons that Senator Murphy's described. And the impacts are not only on the industry, they're on us here in Connecticut because of the impact on jobs. And I am very, very concerned about those impacts. It's not a matter of strict antitrust principle or legal doctrine, but it is a vital concern that I have, and I've expressed it in the Judiciary Committee's antitrust subcommittee hearings. I'm on that subcommittee. We're looking at a bunch of other mergers as well, where I think competitiveness may be at stake and consumers may be impacted. And by the way, other businesses may be impacted. And competition is vital to consumers and a level playing field for businesses so they can offer consumers the best possible products at the best possible prices.
Let me just
Yeah,
mention
yeah, go ahead.
two other quick pieces here,
Sure.
just for folks to know about. The end of the year budget deal involved 2 major changes to the Affordable Care Act that folks should know about. One, they are both a postponement of the Cadillac tax, which was going to hit a lot of employers, a lot of small towns, a lot of boards of education. It's hard, so we get a period of relief that many believe will be permanent. And then a similar abeyance of the tax on medical devices. We've got some big medical device companies here in Connecticut. Matters a lot to them. The second thing is just, as we look at prospective healthcare policy, one of the best chances for bipartisan legislation this year, 2016, is in the area of mental health. As many of you know, I've written the leading mental health reform bill in the Senate, 8 Republican co-sponsors, 8 Democratic co-sponsors. Senator Blumenthal has been very active in this space as well. There is a chance that we get a major reform of our mental health system this year coming out of our committee, the Health and Education Committee. Hard to get anything done in an election year, but this is one of those areas in which the two parties do agree on that we've got a bipartisan bill, a major big bipartisan bill that can be the foundation. And that would be great news for us here in Connecticut because, providers are struggling to keep their heads above water, in part because of some really draconian reimbursement when it comes to mental health services from the federal government.
If I could put a plug in, is this one working? There we go. All right. We're specializing in AV technology today. That's our new.
I'm assuming nobody's heard what I've said.
It's recorded, though, Senator. One thing I'd put a plug in for to both of you is the focus we've had on the health sector as an employment growth. Our Connecticut Health Council has been working with many people in this room to drive more collaboration across all these sectors, providers, payers, researchers, capital, because we do believe that we've got a very unique combination of assets in this state that properly, working properly together can be more fully leveraged. I want to come at the manufacturing and the defense side a little differently. We all know how important that sector is. I know both of you are headed over to Pratt Whitney after this for an announcement with the governor. But let's shift gears a little bit and where both of you mentioned in your opening comments about foreign policy. About the potential authorization issue, about committing any additional ground troops. But first, given where we are in the presidential primaries right now, the issue of immigration, the issue of threats to this country via inappropriate immigration, the concerns for allowing people to have a pathway to citizenship. Could each of you just talk for a few minutes about your perspectives on the immigration issue? And then I want to segue from that to the whole foreign affairs issue. So Senator Blumenthal, why don't you start first with immigration, and then we'll go to Senator Murphy.
Well, this is a central mission for me as a United States Senator. I'm on the Judiciary Committee. I was very proud to help write the bill that was passed by the United States Senate by an overwhelming bipartisan majority. An overwhelming bipartisan majority in favor of giving millions of people, estimates are 11 to 12 million people who now live and work in the shadows. They pay taxes, they have families, many have children who were born here. Give them a path to earned, I stress earned, citizenship. That bill included, by the way, an expanded H-1B visa program. Many of you have talked to me about the need for more skilled workers coming from abroad. Controversial, but I actually was a leader in expanding that program because I think it is vital, not only to train people, our people who are here, who grow up here, who are citizens, but also, when needed by businesses, to enable them to have people come from abroad. And likewise, in the agricultural sector, it was a consensus bill. You know, if you're ever feeling down about America, if you're ever discouraged, you know what you should do? Go down to one of our courthouses. Every Friday in Bridgeport, New Haven, or Hartford, at federal courthouses, there are immigration and naturalization services. And 3 or 4 times a day, you will see 60 to 70 people from all over the world. And when I say all over the world, I mean 40, 50 different countries become United States citizens. For them, it is one of the biggest days in their lives. They will bring their families, their friends. That's not happening in China and Russia. Nobody's going to federal courthouses in China and Russia wanting to become U.S. citizens. We are a beacon of opportunity, and I give them a little talk, and I say, you know, thank you for becoming U.S. citizens. You passed a test that many Americans couldn't pass. And they smile because they know it's true. They will never take for granted that they are U.S. citizens. And we're a nation of immigrants. We should be proud of it. My dad was a refugee in 1935 when he came to this country at the age of 17 to escape persecution in Europe. He had not much more than a shirt on his back. He spoke virtually no English. He knew pretty much nobody here. And this country gave him a chance to succeed. The talent, the energy, the drive that immigrants bring to this country is one of our greatest strengths. Our diversity is something we should celebrate. Do we need to do more intensive and effective screening? Yes, of refugees, but also our visa waiver program. There are 45 million stolen and lost passports around the world. Our visa waiver program enables people to come into this country, 20 million a year from 38 countries around the globe, with passports that often have no biometric identifying information, fingerprints, facial characteristics, irises. We need to strengthen that program. The omnibus bill takes some important steps to strengthen the visa waiver program. More needs to be done. Likewise, overstays on visas. People who come to this country as students or otherwise legally and who overstay their visas, we don't even know exactly how many there are, but we know there are a lot of them, and there has to be more intensive work, better law enforcement to track them and make sure that they don't overstay, as a couple of the 9/11 terrorists did. So the visa and foreign entry programs need to be strengthened. But let's remember who the enemy is. The enemy is ISIS, not the refugees. Strengthen the screening program, but let's conduct a more effective war against the people who really are the threat to us, track down and screen the terrorists who really pose a danger, and make sure we uphold our fundamental values as a nation of immigrants, proud of the fact that we have always been a beacon of freedom and hope and opportunity and refuge for people seeking safety and security from persecution, horrific torture, and religious discrimination abroad, and making sure that we celebrate our diversity. Senator Murphy?
One of the most fascinating economic fields is the study of demographics, and there's really no more important subject when you consider the ability of this country to continue to grow and to, in many ways, leapfrog the rest of the world in terms of the global recovery. We stay a very young nation over the course of the next 20 years, while our economic competitors get grayer and grayer and grayer, meaning that they are going to necessitate a massive transfer of resources to that retiring population. Countries like Russia, whose average age in 2030 will be in the mid-50s, a country like China, who over that same period of time will go from being on average 4 years younger than the United States to 5 years older than the United States, all due to this country's practice of bringing in folks from all over the world to enter our workforce. This narrative that immigration is a drain on our economy is absolute nonsense, and we cut off immigration pathways at our economic peril. And so it's just important to remember that this country's economic strength is rooted in immigration. On this question of refugees, so there is no group of immigrants to this country that have a higher level of security screening than refugees do. And there is no argument to be made that this country has to make a choice between protecting ourselves from terror and torture and rescuing others from terror and torture. In fact, the ability to do both is wrapped into our DNA. It is also a national security imperative for this country. If you look at what happened in places like France and Belgium that caused the radicalization of groups of Muslims such that they would turn on their fellow countrymen, it was in part those countries' practice of isolating, in a way of ghettoizing, Muslim populations and communities through both overt and unconscious methodologies of exclusion. We can't repeat those mistakes, right? Our history is wrapped up in bringing people from other parts of the world, allowing them, whether they be Muslim or Irish or Italian, to retain a piece of their heritage while assimilating into something larger that is America. The politics that are playing out at the presidential level, which result in Muslim populations believing that they aren't part of the American experience any longer, risks America falling into the same trap that over the course of the last 20 years, places like Belgium and France did. If you want to grow radicalization in the United States, then continue to talk this way about the Islamic faith. If you want to avoid repeating the mistakes of other countries, then let's understand that the threat to this country, as Senator Blumenthal said, is not from Muslim refugees, is not from Muslim immigrants. It's from ISIS. It's from a radical terrorist group that has bastardized the Islamic religion in a way that 99% of those that practice that faith don't recognize.
Have you have a shot, Senator Murphy, just to take that and go to ISIS for a minute. And there, we could probably spend the next couple of hours, obviously, talking about relationship with Saudi Arabia, the fraying of relationships with Turkey, and the impact on NATO. But your perspectives, maybe a little bit more narrowly on issues like the authorization question about what the next, either President Obama today or whoever succeeds him in 2017. You've both traveled there. Senator Murphy, take a few minutes and just expand a little bit on your views on our role, our continuing role in Syria and the Middle East overall.
So there's no doubt that the United States has to be the leader in taking the fight to ISIS, and there's no doubt that ISIS has to be degraded and destroyed. There's also no doubt that we've made progress. The fact is, ISIS controls about 30% less territory at the beginning of 2015 than they did at the beginning of 2014. And I know that this isn't comforting to hear, but that loss of territory is in part why they are attempting these high-volume attacks on places like Paris, because the narrative of ISIS is dependent on either of two storylines being perpetuated. Either that they are a growing caliphate, and you got to join now or miss the bandwagon. Now that narrative is diminishing in impact because it's a shrinking caliphate, not an expanding caliphate. Or their secondary narrative is that this is a fight of the Islamic faith against the Christian faith, of East versus West. And so they take these attacks out in places like Paris, in part so as to goad the West into a fight on the ground inside the Middle East, which would drive recruitment. One of the biggest mistakes we could make is to fall for that trap, is to put another 20,000, another 100,000 American troops back into the Middle East, which would just swell the ranks of the very organization that we are fighting. That's why many of us on the Foreign Relations Committee who have been calling for an authorization of military force want it to be one that recognizes that reality. So I desperately want an authorization of military force. But I went down to the floor of the Senate on Thursday afternoon, right before we broke for the weekend, to criticize an authorization that has been introduced by the Republican majority that would be a total, complete, open-ended authorization. The authorization that the Republican majority has introduced has no time limitations, no geographic limitations, no tactical limitations. It would effectively allow the next president to go to war anywhere against almost any enemy for any reason, just in the name of fighting terrorism. That's a mistake that we've made already, once or arguably twice before, that we shouldn't make again. So understand that we can make progress against ISIS with partners. We've been doing that on the ground as the Iraqis get better. We have to force a political process to happen coming out of Syria. We're making progress there, and we need to make sure we don't fall into the traps that could end up turning an enemy today who is probably 6.5 feet tall into an enemy that's 10 feet tall.
Senator Murphy and I, as on many of the issues that you've heard us discuss this morning, have a lot of common ground on this one. I won't repeat what he said, but let me just sort of talk a little bit as a member of the Armed Services Committee about the military options that are available. And to say for the third time, or maybe fourth time, we are at war with ISIS, ISIL, Daesh, whatever you call it, because they are a terrorist extremist group that have no respect for human life and are bent on destroying values and people that we hold dear. And we should be maximizing the potential contributions of our allies in the area in terms of ground troops. You know the old saying, boots on the ground, a term which I find really both too vague and too often used. But in terms of troops to fight this war, we ought to be training, equipping, mobilizing, enlisting, and demanding that the countries in that region do what, for example, the Peshmerga have done so successfully with our support. Air support, where we are superior to any country in the world, and we have the weapons platforms to assist them effectively, as we did in Ramadi. Intelligence interception. We have surveillance and intercept abilities that are technologically almost beyond description. And very, very important, financial intercept. We need to cut the flow of money. We've shown with Iran that we know how to use financial institutions that can have an effect. And they can't wage their war without support from some of the sources. They're receiving it. I won't go into who, but we have the ability to be more effective in that area than we have been. We need to recognize that, as I said at the beginning, there are costs to war. This nation put 14 years of war on a credit card. The wars were fought off budget. The OCO account, Overseas Contingency Operation, I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, but my bet is that no more than a handful of people in this room know what the OCO account is. It's an off-budget account that we use to fight these wars. That's one of the reasons why we have the debt that we do today. And we also, going back to the point I made earlier, we are still going to be paying the human costs of that war. Now, I have two sons. We have 4 children. 2 of my sons have served. One is serving now as a Navy officer. Another was in the Marine Corps Reserve, and as a matter of fact, a reserve unit from Connecticut that was deployed to Afghanistan. As a member of the Armed Services Committee and the ranking member of the Veterans Affairs Committee, I see every day the costs of this war. The costs that will be borne by this nation for years to come. Less than 2% of Americans have had any direct sacrifice through their families in this war. I'm one of only 2 members of the Senate who wears this pin. It's a blue star for someone who has a relative serving, deployed. So we have fought this war with relatively little sacrifice financially, relatively little realization of the cost of the war in human terms, and that's a dimension that I think we really need to consider even as we authorize additional spending for defense. The defense spending levels will rise, fortunately, by $25 billion in each of these next couple of years. And a lot of it will go to weapon systems that will enable us to fight more effectively, whether it's in air superiority, intelligence interception, use of drones, financial cutoffs. The submarines that are a technological wonder enable us to do surveillance as well as special operations, which are key to our fighting these wars, and we need to use special operators in this region. We need to be strong in our defense, stronger even than we are now, but we also need to do it in a smart and fiscally responsible way.
Senator Murphy and Senator Blumenthal, thank you for your leadership on both of those issues. I'll wrap this up. We've got a couple of minutes left. Let's go right into the politics for a brief response from both of you. We know who's playing in the Super Bowl on the 6th with Carolina and Denver. So as we look at November 8th, what are our choices going to be? Senator Blumenthal, I'll start with you in terms of where the November 8th election looks like.
You know, this is probably an issue where I really need to devote much more study and attention. And, you know, I have to admit, Oz, I am still recovering from yesterday.
Yes.
I am still in shock. 20 to 18, I can't believe it. So, I don't
That's one of
know.
the more artful answers I've ever heard to a question, Senator Blumenthal. Senator Murphy.
I'm still in, what are the 5 or 3 stages of grief, anger?
Is your question my prediction?
Yes,
For the,
I'll take anything you
for
can
the
give
Super
me,
Bowl?
Senator.
Yeah, no. Listen. Cam Newton looked looked tough yesterday. So it's probably his to lose. Peyton Manning's getting old. So.
All right, we'll leave it there. A hand for both of our senators.
Wait a minute, wait a minute.
Go ahead.
You know, old is in the eyes of the receiver.
I share your pain, Senator, believe me.
He's still younger than me.
I want to thank both senators for being here. I want to thank Jim Brett, Larry Zabar, and the entire New England Council for helping us today. Patrick McGloin on our end, and a number of other colleagues for making this a reality. Call your attention to one thing on your table. We're hosting just to get into state matters, back to state matters for a second, a forum at the UConn Law School on February 9th around the constitutional amendments as they relate to spending and revisiting the 1993 actions that were taken to ensure that the personal income tax was in. So we commend that to your attention. It'll be an important part of our effort working with a number of the other Metro chambers in this upcoming session. So again, Senator Murphy, Senator Blumenthal, thank you very much for being here. Thank all of you for being here today. Enjoy the rest of the day.